Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on our 3D Scan to Part series by continuing to work in forms to create our wide body fender. Now, in the first two videos of this, Part 5 and Part 6, we looked at generating the form that matches the fender. Now, as I mentioned originally, the idea behind this was for me to take the original sort of shape of the fender and just sort of widen it out. I know that this car came with a wide body version stock, and while I do like those, I wanted to do something different. So this entire series, I don't necessarily know what the end result is going to look like. This is the demo that I did before, carrying the body lines through and sort of using those original cues for the fender. So if we take a look at it in red, we can see that we've got sort of the creased body line carrying up through the fender. But I know that everybody is going to be different in terms of what they're trying to design. So I'm trying to keep everything as general as possible and just look at the techniques, the ways in which we can create some of these features and how we go about it. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to carry on in Fusion, of course. And if you haven't followed along with the last two videos, you can go to the description and you can download the data set that we have here. Talking about this, we have so far been focused in box display, which is the way that we need to sort of train our mind to work. We need to work in box display and we need to get the general shape down in box display. So in this case, when we look at this in box display, you can see that we've got the upper portion of our fender, this sort of flattened feature that comes out. And if we were to use Control and 4 to hide the edges, you can see that on the car. We've got this top feature, this sort of flattened section here, and then the fender comes down and sort of rolls under. We also have some body lines that we're trying to preserve. So as most cars from the 80s, they had fairly hard body lines. You can see that we've got this opening here where this marker is. We've got sort of a hard edge, and that edge disappears into the fender. Now, these are tricky things for us to do when we're talking about doing these in forms, but we're going to work on different ways in which we can capture those details. We'll talk about things like star points and T points and some of the just different methods that we can use. And once again, the end goal of this is to build a 3D printed fender flare, potentially do fiberglass. Again, I'm not really sure what the end goal is. Sometimes when you're designing a part, you have a very clear idea of what the end is going to be. Sometimes you have to just play around with it and see what the goal, how the goalpost changes as you're going. But the important things that we want to focus on are ways in which we can do this and apply this methodology to any different design, not just this boxy 80s car, but anything that you're doing. And it does take a sort of structured approach. You have to think about your design in a couple of different ways. And I've had lots of comments. People really appreciate the series and the stuff we're doing. I've had a couple comments that say I kind of ramble on and go on. And if you're looking for content that's pointed and going to give you the answer in 5 minutes, then this is not going to be it for you. This workflow takes quite a bit of time, so you need to be willing to invest the time to learn the skills in order to do it. As I'm looking at what we have on the screen here, I'm not 100% happy with this, but I really don't want to spend another hour just finalizing the shape for the video series. But in reality, if this is a part that I was going to manufacture, I would spend a lot more time than the hour that we've spent up to this point getting this base shape down. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why are we spending all this time trying to match the fender when in the end we're going to be making something bigger and wider? And there's actually two reasons here. One reason is that we need to understand the way in which forms works. We need to understand the curvature that we create and matching a shape. In this case, we want to understand how we can carry the lines of the fender and utilize them in a flare, a wider version of it. And the second is just practice. You're not really going to be able to get proficient at this unless you practice over and over and over again. So with those in mind, the next step for me is to create another form body to start to build out where the flare is going to be. We can have as many form bodies as we want inside of the same design without finishing forms. Anytime we finish the form, it will convert those to a surface or a solid, whether they're open or closed. When we're thinking about the number of faces that we have, this is going to be important because we want to make sure that we can have nice, smooth continuity between all the different pieces that we put together. But at this stage, I actually don't care how many divisions my wheel arch is going to have and how many divisions the fender is going to have, because we're going to have to fix that stuff when we get to that point anyways. So all I want to do is I want to make sure that I have enough divisions with any new bodies that I have to capture the curvature, but not too many, not too few. So to do this, we're going to start by creating a cylinder. I'm going to just select the right view, and I want to place it roughly at the center of the wheel. Now this is where if I had the entire scan of the wheel or maybe some reference points, it would help. But as long as we get relatively close, we'll be fine. We're going to start to drag it out, and I want to go till I'm roughly tangent with the wheel arch. Obviously, this is not the right shape. Most cars will have a fairly round wheel arch or wheel opening, but they won't be perfect, so you will have to manipulate it. When we rotate this thing around, the second thing that I want to do is I want to reduce the number of edges that we have in the horizontal direction, in this case in X. I don't need a bunch of different divisions. I just want to make sure that I'm creating the shape. And also I can make this very thin. It doesn't have to be very wide at this point. But one thing I do want to do is I want to increase the number of divisions to something like 16 for the wheel opening. And the main reason that I want to do this is because when dealing with a cylindrical form, it is much harder for us to get that form to be nice and round, or at least mostly round, after the fact when we start adding edges. So to increase the number of edges that we have in this circular form or this cylinder is going to help us downstream, because we don't have to worry as much about inserting those edges. We can just tweak them wherever we want them. So I'm going to start by saying okay. Then I'm going to use modify edit form. I'm going to change my selection to body. I'm going to select the entire body, and from the front, I'm going to move this out to roughly where the wheel arch is. Now, again, you might be thinking, we're building a wider version. Why on earth would you put it where the wheel arch is now? Well, all cars are going to have some sort of curvature to them. So what I want to do is I want to put that exactly where it needs to be, and I'm going to match the shape of the car, and then I'll make it wider. Once again, we're going to take the cues from the original car, and then we'll sort of build from there. Now I'm going to change my selection filter back to all. I'm going to left click to deselect, double click this inside edge, and I'm just going to move it in. The main reason that I'm going to move it in now is because I want to make sure that this outside edge is going to have enough freedom to move to match the shape of the car. I'm going to left click, I'm going to OK the edit form, and now I want to delete some of this. So in deleting some of this form, I don't need to keep it all. I only need to really keep the upper portion. So I'm going to go ahead and box select the bottom and just hit delete. This is just going to leave me most of the fender where I need it. So you can see that it comes to about here. It's a little bit high in the back, but again, depending on whatever you want your fender flare to look like, if you want it to stop short of the bottom of the car, then this might be okay for you. We can always extrude that out and play with it later, but for right now, this is going to be what we want. The next thing that we need to do is we need to start to get it into roughly the right shape. And we can do this once again by selecting the entire body, because what we're going to do is we're going to be scaling it out. I want to move my pivot point. I'm going to reset my pivot point. I need to make a selection, and then I'm going to move it down to approximately the center of the wheel. We're going to say okay. Then I'm going to scale this outward. And what I'm looking to do is try to match the shape of that fender. Once I have it relatively close on one side, I'm going to change my selection back, and then I'm going to box select everything on the left side. And what we can do is we can try to scale this out. Once again, I'm going to move the pivot point. I'm going to put it roughly where the center of the wheel is. And then I'm going to scale this out, and you can see that I'm starting to sort of push it into position. Now, this is not going to be perfect. We're never going to get it exactly right, just scaling things. So it is important that you get comfortable with moving these edges and faces around. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to find where those intersections are. I'm going to box select around them, which if we rotate, this is going to grab that entire edge. And once we grab that, I'm just going to move it up and out. What I'm trying to do is move it sort of radially away from the center. I'm going to find that other one, box select it, and sort of move it up and out as well. So what we're looking to do is roughly match the shape of the fender. Obviously, if you're making a fender flare, maybe you're trying to have bigger wheels that don't necessarily fit in these arches, then you can scale them up or down or move them however you need to. But right now, that's not the important thing. Right now, we want to match the shape of the OEM opening as closely as possible. Everything looks pretty good. There are some areas where we could put a little bit more work in. I'm going to go ahead and grab this, maybe move it out just a little bit, grab this one and move it out. The more that we do this, the more out of round this feature is going to get, and the harder it's going to be for us to control. So make sure that you don't move too much. You just move it little by little and get happy with those results. Next, what we want to do is we want to start to get this sort of shape how we hope to see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select each vertice and I'm going to start moving them. Again, remember that we want to keep it moving horizontal. So if you take a look at the dialog box, I'm going to keep that second number at 0. We could also select the entire edge. We could move the pivot point to the inside, and we could simply scale it down in that direction. That would work fine. At this point, moving it into a box display can be helpful. Alt and 1, this means that you sort of get away from worrying too much about what that smooth shape looks like, and you can focus just on the box display, getting it to be approximate to the shape of the car. Now, this is an important step because it's hard for us to get this right without doing it in 3D on the car. And what I mean by that is oftentimes with cars, the rear portion of the fender will flare in a different amount than the front portion. And you can kind of see that here. This back section here is flaring out a different amount. So again, I'm going to move the pivot point. I'm going to scale this in just a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Move the pivot point to the inside. And again, the reason we're moving the pivot point is because we don't want that inside edge to move. We want the inside edge to stay where it is so that it's still a nice flat edge. And we only want to move the outside. Now I'm going to go back to my smooth display. I'm going to hide the mesh for a second. And when we look at this from the front, what we should see is that the front section of the fender moves in more than the rear section. And this is common on cars. You can see that I did make a mistake and I moved an entire edge possibly. But again, we can make adjustments and we can manually move things around. At this stage, the inside of this wheel arch doesn't really matter to me because this is essentially a sacrificial surface. The only reason that I'm building this surface is so that I can build the lip away from the car. So that brings me to our next step. I'm going to double click this edge. Once again, I want to reset the pivot point. For this, I'm going to bring back the mesh. I'm going to set the pivot point at the top center and then move it down to approximately the center of the wheel. Again, I don't have a real good reference. This is probably a little bit low, but it's okay. Once we have that, we're going to hold down Control and Alt. So remember, Alt is going to allow us to extrude an edge. Holding down Control in addition to that will allow us to extrude with a crease. And then we're going to use the scale out and plane. And what we're doing here is we're building a scaled out lip. So that scaled out lip, you can see that each edge is going away from the center of our pivot point, the center of the wheel, hopefully. What we're doing here is we're building out the lip of the fender. Once again, depending on your design intent here, you may have a larger or smaller lip. In some cases, you might not have any lip at all. But in this case, what I like to do is I like to overbuild this, and then I'm going to come back, select that edge, and I'm going to insert another edge. And the reason I want to insert another edge is because now what I'm doing is I'm controlling where that lip actually is going to be. I'm going to double click and then delete that outside. Now, that's kind of an extra step that we don't always need, but sometimes visually it's easier to make that larger, and rather than scaling it down, we can just insert another edge. Remember, with the simple insertion mode, it'll be flat. And because we have the crease, that's perfectly fine, and just delete the outside. So now if we take a look at the fender or the sort of OEM matching portion of the fender that we built, and we take a look at the body that we created for the lip of the fender, we can see that we're now starting to recreate the OEM fender. Now this is as far as we need to take the recreation of the OEM fender, because at this stage, we no longer really need to match the entire fender. We matched the opening and the flare of the fender, and we matched the base shape of the fender. So now what we can do is we can move this entire body out to wherever we want the flare to be. So for example, if we wanted to be 25 millimeters wider, we would just move this out 25. If we wanted to be 50 millimeters wider, we'd move it out 50. So it all depends on how extreme you want to go, and it depends on the look that you're trying to achieve. So in this case, I'm going to go a bit extreme and say 50 millimeters. That's 2 inches or roughly 2 inches. And this car right now has a 15-inch rim with a 215 tire. Now, I know for a fact that on these flat side cars, plenty of people have tucked 9-inch wide rims under the fronts of these. You need to do a little bit of work with coilovers to get some more clearance, and you need the right size rim. I've seen 17s, I've seen 18s on here with, those 9-inch wide rims. Factory, the wide body rims came in a 7 front and an 8 rear, or if you had an SHP package car, it would be an 8 front and a 9 rear with different offsets. And I know I've seen cars that have tucked the 7s and the 8s under the front very easily, and I've seen ones with rolled fenders that have put the 9s up front. And it's a lot of tire, it's a lot of rim. My hope is to run probably a 245 on the front. So going from a 215, which is what I have now, the stock wide body cars had 205s on the front. Going an extra 50 millimeters will take me to 265, making no other changes to the back spacing of the rim. So a bit more than I want, but again, for the purposes of the video, we're going to play around with these shapes, and making something a bit more extreme is obviously going to look a bit better. So now that I have that where I want it, and I have the original body, now we can start to plan out and think about ways in which we want to combine these together. And this is actually probably the second toughest stage of a design like this. The first toughest stage is to sort of visualize where all these patches and things need to be. But now that we get to the point where we're trying to connect everything together, it really begins getting very difficult. And there are a few schools of thought, a few ways in which we can do this. One way is for us to go in to modify, subdivide, and subdivide this entire body using the exact method. So what I'm going to do is, if I select the entire body and use the exact method, it's going to keep the shape exactly the same, and it's just going to divide it up. Each face will now be 4 faces. What this allows me to do is maintain that original shape. And now what I can do is I can have additional edges that I want to use to sort of combine things. That is one school of thought, and oftentimes that will work out okay. However, that's a good way for you to get in trouble, especially if you're just starting, if you're trying to learn forms and play around with it. It can be very tricky for you to get the curvature and the connections and all that just right. So the way that I like to approach this is I'm going to rename body 2. I'm going to call this OE Fender, and I'm going to call body 3 my wheel arch. I'm going to take the OE Fender and I'm going to copy and paste it. So I'm going to just do a copy. You can do Control C, Control V, and this allows me to have an exact copy of the Fender piece. And what that allows me to do is start to cut it up and hack it up without worry of affecting all the work we did to match the OE Fender. So making these copies early on, because forms is a direct and destructive modeling approach, can make sure that you just have something that you can fall back on without having to go back to a previously saved version or anything like that. So making a copy early on is going to be a nice way for you to just have sort of that safety margin. You can do that with the wheel arch as well. I didn't spend as much time on that, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. Then the next step for me, oftentimes, is determining what I want the flare to look like. If I want it to be a more boxy style, like the original 86 to 89 cars, or if I'm trying to match sort of that original that I showed you, where it's smoother and it carries the OEM lines out. These are different ways in which we can approach the design. I can't tell you what's going to be right or wrong for your design, but thinking about what you want it to look like at this stage will be helpful. Now, I am a big fan of using things like scale and extruding everything together. So for example, if I wanted to start a more traditional type flare, something that you would see on, let's say 70s JDM cars, like a 240Z, then I would take this entire lip, hold down Alt, and begin extruding it back, maybe let go and extrude it back one more time. If I take a look at this in smooth display, you can see that I'm starting to build out what's a more traditional fender. Then you can use your scale. We can double click this edge. We can scale this out. and we can start to build out those shapes and determine where each piece is going to hit together. Again, not really the style I'm going for on a build like this, but this is a good way for you to get started, especially if you're having trouble visualizing. Another way that you can do this, especially on a car like this where we have harder edges and lines, is extrude some of the geometry out. So for example, I can select these two edges, I can hold down Alt, and I can start to pull this forward. And what I'm doing here is I'm matching the edges that I have in the underlying geometry. So once I get to about here, I'm going to scale this down a little bit. I'm also going to scale it vertically, pull it forward, and just play around with the shapes. And once I've got this edge, I'm going to hit Alt again and pull another one forward. Again, what we can do is we can use things like scale, rotate, and just pull it into position how you would expect it to look. Now, if it's not matching, so for example, you can see these two vertices here look okay, but this one doesn't, then we can start to do some manual adjustments. And what I want to do here is I want to take these edges and think about them from every view. So from the front, this is going to start to flare in to meet the body. Once again, we can use things like scale to try to get it right. This edge here, I might want to pull it down, get it a little bit closer. This one here, and just manually move things around. At this stage, we don't really have to worry about connecting things together, but we want to work on visualizing things in box display. So at this stage, I don't get too hung up on making sure that I'm lining up with all the edges, but I do spend some time looking at the different shapes in box display. That's going to be the most important thing for me. So if I want this drastic flare, I can take this edge, look at it from the front, and pull it in. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to use sort of the OEM shape and then flare it out. Now, I don't really suggest going back and forth between smooth display as you're learning, because what you're going to end up seeing is some drastic changes in the shape here. So if I hide the OE Fender and I start to take a look at the shape here, you might begin to get hung up because it doesn't have a lot of additional detail to it. And that can be problematic because then it starts to drive you to add more edges and add more features. So I really want you to focus on using box display for as long as possible. Back here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude this edge down. And I'm going to come to this lip right here. That's where I'm sort of working up front. So I'm going to work there in the back. And now that I've extruded that down a little bit, I'm going to begin doing the same thing on this back edge. I want to take a couple of these edges. From the right side, I'm going to begin extruding them out. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that these don't line up with this defining edge that I have, and that's going to be a problem for me that I need to fix. There are a couple ways that we can fix it, but right now, all I'm worried about is just roughing out the shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Alt. I'm going to bring this back. Because we're right at an edge, I'll probably take this all the way back to the edge of the fender. And I probably want to scale this down so it's closer to vertical. And then from the back, we want to begin to get it to match the car. So this means that I likely need to start manipulating individual vertices. Now again, plenty of different styles of wide bodies. You can try to match something that you've seen out there that you like, or you can come up with your own style. And it's the great thing about doing this in 3D, being able to copy what you have here and just play around with different shapes until you have one that you're happy with. Now, I think it's important that you do take the time to create a couple different concepts and versions, and don't get too hung up on just one version of whatever you're designing. You can use those initial versions as sort of inspiration for the concept. Maybe you have the initial idea in your head, like with the Fender that I presented. You know, this was my initial idea. It might be what I go with. It might not be. I really don't know. But this is what I had in my head and what I wanted to see how it would look in 3D. But that doesn't mean that that's the final shape that the car will take. Now that I've started to build out these shapes front and rear and kind of match them to the car, you can see I've left a little gap here. I kind of like that style where the wide body stays wide and where it meets the OEM car, you can kind of still see the OEM fender underneath it. I really like the look of that. So that's probably what I'm going to go with on what we're doing here, which means that this could be a little bit wider as well. So we could bring it out. 50 millimeters is probably too much, but we can have a little bit more of a gap there and just sort of exaggerate that. The next thing that we need to figure out is what the upper section of this is going to look like. Now, again, what we can do is we can kind of think about these shapes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this edge from the front, I'm going to go Alt, and I'm going to bring this up all the way to the top. I'm going to let go of Alt and do it again, and just sort of bring it over to bridge the fender. So that, again, what we're doing is we're sort of building it out in individual views. Now, obviously from the side, it doesn't look right at all. What I'm going to do is just move these vertices down until I'm happy with their location. You can see that I want to get them to match that OEM Fender position. That looks okay. And same thing up here. I'm just going to go ahead and take these and move them down until they're in a location that makes sense for me. Do this with the front one as well. And then rotate it around and just take a look. So it can be pretty hard for us to get, I originally pulled it based on here, but that's obviously at the back of the fender. It really needs to be here, which is why we do this from the front view, the side view, the top view, and just take a look. Double clicking the mouse will bring us back in, and that looks pretty good. Again, this is just the visualization stage. Don't get too hung up on connecting these two things together just yet, but work out the shapes that you want. If it's starting to get a bit hard for us to see the differences between these, we can actually take this OEM offset. So I'm going to say OK to my edit form. I'm going to make a change to the appearance. By default, everything in Fusion is steel unless you've changed that default. And even though we're working in forms, what we can do is we can take this, go to our appearances, and just change the color of it. I like to use either a paint or a plastic. One of the reasons I like to use paint is because when you're modeling, it's not really showing up as glossy. But then if you go into, say, do a render, it'll really show up as something different. So in this case, I like to use something like a glossy white. Makes it really easy for me to see the gray of what I'm working with over top of it. Now remember, we are going to start cutting the white part away at some point once we determine how we want everything to fit together. But right now is really important that we're just roughing out the shape, starting with the front and rear, figuring out how we want it to flare together. At any point in time, you can also bring back the mesh and just see how it looks on the car itself. You can kind of see where we're building. Here's the original flare, and here is where we're working. Now, it is important to note if you're doing something like this and you're extending the width of your car 2 inches or more on either side, this means you are going to have to cut away the OEM fender. Now, it can be pretty tough, especially if you have a fender that's in good shape. Mine is in good shape at the arch, but underneath, if you watched any of the scanning videos, there is some rust underneath here. It's just kind of the nature of a lot of these cars. It's rusting where it attaches to the car. There are fenders available, but I'm not going to buy a new fender that is just going to get hacked up. So I will probably end up cutting my fender, unfortunately, when I do this. But again, that's part of it. We're modifying these cars. It's by no means a pristine show car or anything like that, but I am the second owner. I've had this car for quite a while. I do know its history. I know the original owner. It has a pretty cool, pretty interesting history, but it's still not perfect. It's still rusty. The fender still needs to be replaced or fixed or something. Same thing in the back. There is rust in the rears as well, and all that needs to be fixed, so why not modify it? So at this stage, let's do, we're getting close to that 30-minute mark. So what I want to talk about is going to be sort of fixing or matching the position of these edges. Now, I mentioned that this is pretty tricky for us to do when we're talking about a round arch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click that edge. I'm going to go to Modify and Insert Edge. I'm going to do a both option, which will put one on either side and say OK. Remember, when we use the simple insertion mode, it's going to do those completely flat. It's not going to change anything here, which means when we go to a smooth display, we're going to be messing up the curvature in that area. So what you want to look for when you do this, if you're happy with the position of that edge, you're going to be moving these so that you have a gradual change in curvature between all the edges. And what you're probably going to find is that you need to do this on both sides or all sides. and then just double check your smooth display. This is probably one of the trickiest areas to work with, is to try to make something more cylindrical. There is a cylindrical option, or cylindrify is the name of the tool, but that doesn't really work for what we're doing here because these aren't true cylinders. These wheel arches tend to start off cylindrical in nature, but they do tend to get a little bit out of round. So that looks pretty good. It's probably not perfect, but that is at least close enough for what we're doing now. So I'm going to go back to box display and continue to work with that. Now what I want to do, or what I want to identify here, is where this edge needs to be. So I'm going to take this edge here. I'm going to use modify and slide edge and see if I can get it a little bit closer. It's not going to be perfect, but what I'm looking to do is get that top point about where that edge is. I'm going to say okay. Then I'm going to go to modify and insert point. I'm going to go from this point here to this point, say okay. Then I can select this edge and delete it. And this will allow me to start building out the fender flare and try to maintain some continuity between these lines. Now, if you remember in an earlier video, what we ended up doing is we added some additional edges using bevel, and we talked about ways in which we can control that geometry. We're not quite at that stage yet, so I don't want to get hung up on doing that because we are working in box display. But what I want to do again is I'm going to use slide edge, and I'm just going to try to pull that up. Not going to be perfect. Again, you can go back and forth between smooth display. You can see that we've got some problems in this area. You can see how wide this fender lip is getting compared to here, even though it's the same here. And again, it's because the surrounding curvature is pulling it like that. But at this stage, all I'm doing is I'm roughing out the shape in box display. I want to get a very low polygon or low number of face count shape that I'm happy with before I take the time to start trimming up the underlying fender and building pieces that go together. Now at this stage, we're an hour and a half into trying to build this wide body, and it does take some time. If I just sat here and did this without trying to narrate and walk through it, it's going to take hours of time. It's just going to take time for you to get a good quality result. Could we slap something together in 30 minutes? Of course we could. We could rush through it and we would have some problems that need to be addressed, but we could get through it. But if you take your time when you're starting and you work methodically, you try to keep the number of faces as low as possible, you try to keep the spacing fairly consistent, and you work with things like copies of the bodies that you're working on, you start to build out the rough shape with this low polygon model. Later on, once we have the box display looking roughly like we want, that's the time when we go back and we start adding additional edges and we start controlling the shape a bit more. But if you try to do it at this part of the design, it's just going to be too hard to control. You're going to end up deleting a lot of work anyways. So what I want you to do at this point is I want you to continue to play around with this if you are following along, and try to come up with a shape that you're happy with. Try to spend a little time. And I'd like to know in the comments, do you want me to keep going through every step of this process? Or would you rather that I jump around and provide models that have a bit more detail to them? I'm happy to do either option. It's just going to take a good bit of time to walk through this process. And I've done it in a couple of other videos and examples like the MR2, but in that case, I wasn't able to provide the scan. In this case, at least you have the scan to work from. So again, let me know in the comments, do you want me to keep doing this, walking through every stage of this design, or would you rather that we jump to maybe critical areas and have a little bit more of a finished version of the design that I hand off to you? And if there's anything specific that you want to see, if you have ideas on different wide bodies that you like and maybe are potentially tricky to model, I'd love to hear that as well. But at this point, thanks for watching as always, and we'll see you in the next one.